music department, they're going to be performing to music Brian Turner's poem, Here Bullet. Without further ado.
Here, bullet, if a body is what you want, then here is bone and gristle and flesh. Here is the clavicle snapped wish, the aorta's open valves, the lymph aches at the synaptic gap. Here's the adrenaline rush you crave, that inexorable flight, that insane puncture into heat and blood. And I dare you to finish what you've started, because here, bullet, here is where I complete the word you bring, hissing to the air. Here is where I'm known. The barrel's cold esophagus, triggering my tongue's explosives. For the rifling I had inside of me, each twist of the rod spun deeper, because here, bullet, here is where the world ends every time. Here, bullet, 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 here.
That's the way to start a week. I have the privilege of welcoming to you Brian Turner. He is a U.S. Army veteran who served in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Iraq. A portion of his poetry arose from his time at war. This was in early 2000s. And his book of poetry, Here Bullet, received a great deal of acclaim. The New York Times Book Review described his writing as really amazing and being able to explain what war is like. The quote is, "Turner has sent back a dispatch from a place arguably more incomprehensible than the moon, the war in Iraq, and deserves our thanks." But to call Mr. Turner a war poet is a disservice. He's just a poet, period, full stop. And the breadth of his work is prodigious. He's written 5 books of poetry, has penned numerous essays and a memoir, My Life as a Foreign Country, which earned critical acclaim. Whether reflecting on nature, war, grief, or our dying planet, Turner's work shines a light on the human condition. He's been awarded the National Endowment of Arts and Guggenheim Fellowships and has been featured in a litany of literary journals. His most recent book of poetry is titled The Wild Delight of Wild Things. It's time to let him come up here and read some of his work. Then we'll have a short question and answer period. We'll be all done by noon so you can make it to your next class. Without further ado, people, Brian Turner.
The bodies lie along the shoulder of the road. The bodies lie in an ambulance, a truck bed, a stretcher. The bodies are strobed in flaring lights, color of fire, color of night. The bodies rest within the fuselage of a plane at 36,000 feet. The bodies contemplate silence as they wait in the morgue. The bodies are moved from room to room, 1 hour to the next. The bodies are bathed by strangers and by those who love them. They are numbered and recorded with signatures and stamps. They are forgotten by all save those who love them. They are left to the fields, to the green embrace of earth. They are given sunlight and storm, a shadow of wings descending. They are given to rivers, to fire, to ash and the wind-driven rain. They are carried on the shoulders of stone-faced men. They are serenaded with tears, with the instruments of suffering. They are eulogized in great halls and within the confines of loneliness. They are lowered into the ground and into the vaults of memory. They are disassembled and dispersed by the steady labor of time. They learn more about compassion as they are lifted in someone's arms. They learn more about the sacred as voices call out around them. They learn more about grieving as their eyes are sewn shut. The bodies are moved from room to room, 1 hour to the next. They are numbered and recorded with signatures and stamps. The bodies are bathed by strangers and by those who love them. The bodies contemplate silence as they await the mortician, and they are forgotten by all save those who love them. I don't know why. My great-grandfather was a preacher, and somehow when I said those last lines, it felt very preacherly, you know, and I got a lectern up here. And I hope I in no way sound like I'm an authority. I see myself, maybe you find this in yourself too, as an observer and a curious human being, wondering about the wondrous things of the world and also the very difficult things of the world, you know, like whole countries or whole people razed to rubble. What bodies are we talking about here? I'm talking about my own, maybe all of ours in some ways, maybe some that we may be connected to or responsible for. What do we do about that, you know? You'll find it's kind of a truism about poets. We're not very good at answering questions. There is a Q&A near the end of this. We're going to have a conversation. But what we're good at is, I think we're good at asking questions or hopefully getting deeper into the question. But never try to pin down a poet for an answer on something. Is this what we're supposed to be doing? Everybody doing all right? Yeah, okay. This poem is called Sunflowers. What they don't tell you about war is how much a bank ledger might shape a decision tree. The price of fuel, sunflower oil, durable goods when they're floating on an ocean with no delivery in sight. I don't usually pause a poem, but as I say, durable goods when they're floating on an ocean with no delivery in sight. And we can think of bodies of water right now where ships are all lined up waiting to try to move, you know? That bullets can skip along the surface of a wall like stones over water. That it's a bad idea to tape the sheet glass windows of your home, but smart to roll down the windows of a car when fleeing a firefight. That you should open your mouth to avoid rupturing your eardrums when a shockwave rolls by. The civilians are the bravest of all. See how they face the invaders, saying, take these seeds and put them in your pockets, so at least sunflowers will grow when you all lie down here. What they don't tell you about war is that a soldier's oath is not only to be the one who puts out the fire, but to be the one who starts the fire to begin with, to be the one who carves a hollow center deep into the word suffering. War is born of the obscene, a disfiguration of words like love or humanity. This much we know. These things we do, these ghosts we live with, how they call out to us sometimes, asking for water Such a simple thing, a glass of water. It's an odd ending to the poem. My best friend died of cancer in 2012. He had the same first name as me. Brian Voigt was his name. I'm from Fresno, California. We were in a band down in Fresno. Probably hard to believe, but I used to have hair halfway down my back and wore little skeleton earrings, sometimes a little scuba diver. Other time, played bass guitar, in this band. I think it was at one point we were called Los Muertos Muchachos. And then another time we were Chrome Grandma and the Shakes. And I never knew who was Chrome Grandma and who were the Shakes, But I drank a lot of caffeine, so I was like, I gotta be with the Shakes, probably. But when he passed, a year before he passed, actually, maybe it was a little bit before that. I remember, I live in Florida now, and he was in Fresno back home. And we were talking on the phone, and he said, and he knew he was dying, and he said, you don't even know how good a glass of water tastes. He was so right, But the water also has another resonance. I was a soldier in Iraq, and before I went there, this is in 2003 to 2004, but before we deployed, we didn't know, there were two major wars going on. There was Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time, and I didn't know which war we were going to be sent to. So I was reading about both to try to understand. I was reading poetry and some history and things like that. And I came across, during the time of Muhammad, when Muhammad was alive, and you'd have these palatial tents. If you go to Istanbul, you can go into the archaeological museum and see some of the artifacts that were in these massive tents where Muhammad would basically run a state as well as a spiritual calling and a religion. And people would come to petition him, and they would be in serious matters of state kind of things, and then also musicians and artists and poets. And there was a poet, Khansa, Khansa, and she was a pre-Islamic believer in I believe it's called the Jawahiri sect. It's a different type of spirituality or religion. And she was also a poet, and she would write about her brothers that died in battle, and so she often wrote poems about those events. And the Jawahiris believed that when you die, if you die an unnatural death, like in war, your owl spirit breaks free and then perches on your gravestone and calls out for 100 years for revenge. They call for water, but it's like calling for revenge. But if you die a natural death, like a heart attack or something, then your owl spirit would go to the family home and would live inside the family home for about 100 years, if I remember right. It'd be more like a guide or a counselor, and just to be there with you. So I say, these ghosts we live with, how they call out to us sometimes, asking for water, such a simple thing, a glass of water. I think I might read a passage from this book, My Life as a Foreign Country, which David was so kind to mention earlier. And just so you know, I donated a copy to the library this morning. So if you're like me, I was partly an English major when I was in Fresno City College and then Fresno State. That was my path. Partly because I could afford the books, I looked over at the science majors like, how do you even do it, $200 a semester just to get some books. And worth it, but difficult sometimes. But there's one there if you'd like to read it. I have 3 or 4, I think, in my bag. And I'd like to give you one, David, wherever David is. There you are. And Omari, I'd also like to give you one to thank you for coming here and making art of this as well. Kurt, you already have one, so I think we're good. But if I have an extra 1 or 2 copies, come up to me afterwards, and I'm happy to sign a copy for you. This is a moment when I was in Iraq. I changed the name from this to Sergeant Zapata because he became a Special Forces guy. But at the time, we were sergeants in the infantry in Iraq. And I'll just leave it for now. I think it speaks for itself. Sergeant Zapata wore headphones connected to the mine detector in his hands, which hovered 2 to 3 inches over the soil, reflecting the moonlight falling through the bare trees of the orchard. His squad automatic weapons gunner, so hard for me to say because we always called it a SAW gunner. We just did the acronym. But the SAW gunner, Lou, pulled security as the mine detector swept from right to left and back again, pausing here and there as Zapata listened for all that might be buried in the earth. Lou stood with a small foldable shovel in one hand and the barrel of his weapon pointed up at the planet Mars. He mulled over which type of bumper to buy for the '67 Shelby he had stored in the garage of his parents' home back in San Francisco. I was in the animal stall with the prisoners, all the men from the adjacent farmhouses who were of military age. We'd cinched their hands behind their backs and the flex cuffs binding their wrists together, pulled sandbags over their heads, and we'd walk them in a silent line from their homes and across the dirt courtyard. The women and children were gathered together in one of the front rooms of the biggest house, given blankets to keep themselves warm, a guard standing in the doorway to watch over them as their homes were thoroughly searched. In the animal stall, each man was separated a few paces from the other prisoners and made to place the instep of one foot over the heel of the opposite leg before being guided down into a kneeling position in the loose straw at the center of the enclosure. What I mean by that is they go like this. Like that. You push them down, and if you're on your knees, it's almost impossible to pop up. You have to fall over and get back up. The morning call to Azan wouldn't happen for another 2 or 3 hours. For now, we leaned in close to the hooded men and whispered into their ears the words we most wanted to hear from them. How when, motherfucker? How when? The sergeant to my right was stuck on repeat, circling the prisoner. You know, don't you? Yeah, you know. I know you fucking know, squirrely little bastard, but it's all right. All you got to do is tell us what you know. The muzzle of his carbine rested against the man's back. A milk cow stared at us with its huge brown eyes. The milk cow tilted its head from one side to the other, then lowered its mouth and nostrils to snuff its breath in quickly and blast a short snot of air into the straw, which rose in a cloud of dust and paper-thin husks. Another soldier called out from the haystack in the corner, I got nothing here, Sergeant. Want me to keep checking? The sergeant seemed to ignore the question. Instead, he leaned closer to the hooded man before him. You want me to have him keep looking? Why don't you just tell us instead? Hours later, when the dawn breaks over the far mountains, some higher up will realize we've raided the wrong site and that the target house is actually beyond the date palms across the river. We'll have to remove the hoods from these men, gingerly cut the flex cuffs of the sawtooth blades of our leathermans, and then shake their hands, bowing to them, apologizing constantly, our gloved hands palmed out to them, saying, we're so sorry, Sadiq, but my apologies, I'm really, and so on as we back up, mount our vehicles, and roll out. But for the time being, I stood in the animal stall and studied the men slumping forward in the straw. The night wore on. Most of them shivered in the cold, one of them sobbing to himself. While in the front room of the large farmhouse, another soldier stared through night vision goggles at the women and children huddled in a corner. They whispered to one another, hushing the sleepless children in their laps, and the soldier in the doorway traversed the room with his left eye in a luminous globe, that insomniac green, the color of fresh leaves lit from within. And he stopped his gaze on a woman staring directly back at him, whose eyes reflected in bright ovals of phosphorescent green. So the soldier quickly turned away, shuffled, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the hallway, cleared his throat. In the orchard rows beyond, Lou continued to think of San Francisco and Ford Mustangs, while Sergeant Zapata paused with a search coil of the metal detector over a slight depression, closed his eyes, and listened to the earth. You know, part of the reason I share that with you today is because at one point after this happened, a few months later, we were at a very large air base, and Sergeant Zapata, again, had his real name slightly different. He had been born in Mexico. He'd been raised in LA, and he spoke, he spoke Spanish and English with great fluency. He used to, up in the hatch, I remember he used to sing these Spanish love songs. He told me they were ballads from like the 1940s, and that his like great-grandfather or grandfather really loved or something. And I always loved hearing him sing those songs. And at one point on that large air base, he went over to this room, and there were mortars that would come in, and there was there was at least one severe attack that I know of where a lot of people were injured and a few people killed. So you could be killed standing at a bus stop, sleeping in your bunk. We had these tents that we were sleeping in, very large tents. And anyways, he went over to this building, went inside, put his weapon up against it. He sat at a desk and took a test. And then when he finished the test, he got his weapon, and then he found out that he failed the test. And the test was to see if he could become an American citizen. And he failed the test, and then he took his weapon and went back to work, and then continued the rest of the year that we were in the country. He later got his citizenship and all that, but I just remember thinking, you know, if he were killed, he could have been killed while doing the test, or right afterwards, or while walking back, thinking about how he hadn't passed the test. Mortar round could come in and kill him, you know. But I remember thinking too, that, and if he died, I think at the time, I'm not sure if this is still true or how it works, but I think he could have been buried in a military cemetery. And, you know, on Memorial Day or Veterans Day especially, oftentimes you go by, you'll see at cemeteries, they'll have the flags out there. There would have been a flag put on his grave. And sometimes you'll see the old war vets with like a sharp salute, you know, maybe news crews and stuff filming it, giving respect to his service. But he'd failed the test, you know. And I remember thinking, like, no one has ever tested me, you know? Like, I never had to pass a test. Why do I get to just walk but not even think about it? And yet my brother in arms, could have died without being given the respect of recognizing that I don't know, this can go on. Maybe at some point I'm going to move that chair a little closer and we'll have this conversation I mentioned earlier. Maybe that's something to talk about. I think I'll read a poem. Are there English majors here? Okay, we got one. Oh, right up here, we got a contingent. All right. This might get a little rough. It might be a little dry, but I'm going to read something for you. It's a very simple poem, and maybe we can talk about it for a minute. It's called Observation Post number 71. But I hope I can make this in a way that may be useful for everyone. It's a very quiet poem. Owls rest in the vines of wild grapes. Eucalyptus trees shimmer, and from the minaret, a voice. Each life has its moment. The sunflowers lift their faces toward dawn as milk cows bellow in a field of trash. I've seen him in the shadows. I've watched him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song hums in the wings of sandflies. My mind has become very clear. So a very simple kind of poem. We've got, oddly, with these grapes and eucalyptus trees. I remember as a son of the San Joaquin Valley with the eucalyptus and the grapes, and I lived right near grape vineyards, table grapes, and we, when I got to Iraq, several times there was this visual echo of home because there were so many eucalyptus trees, and a lot of the landscape looked very similar to the Central Valley and further south a little bit. That last stanza is why to bring it up for the English majors and for the writers especially, because the words on the page here, the way they're typed in the book, they're exactly the same words, but in a slightly different order. The original order was, in the last stanza, my mind has become very clear. I have seen him in the shadows. I have watched him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song hums in the wings of sandflies. So it ends on this image, right? I don't break the usual trope, like in war literature from the sort of Western tradition going through English, like Wilfred Owen, Sassoon, that kind of tradition, coming to like poems of Vietnam with Bruce Weigel, Yusef Komunyakaa. There's oftentimes the trope is that in war literature, among many, one of them is that there's the view of the literature is looking from the point of view of the optical instrument that's connected to some type of lethal instrument, looking at someone vulnerable and thinking about the vulnerable. And I don't break that trope, I do the same thing, which tells us as writers and artists, there's very fertile ground and very interesting work to be done to write from the point of view of the person who's vulnerable, looking at the person who has power over them, you know? I think we can learn so much more there. I mean, we can get to that a little bit later. This gets to a point of when I was in grad school and I was studying poetry, remember one of my friends saying to me, the poet Stacey Lynn Brown, she said, you know, Brian, you write these poems, and it's kind of like a V shape. Like you start off with an example, something's happening, very visual. We have owls calling out in the grapes, eucalyptus trees, a minaret, you know, very sort of cinematic and visual. And then you come down and usually they'll say something and they're just, oof, you kind of feel it in your gut. And this is the key point. She said, did the V with a very sharp point, like it finishes there, it's ended. And she said, if you could just find some way to open up the ending a little, to leave a little space for the reader to participate in the construction of meaning. And I thought about that for a few years. I was in the back of my mind trying to learn, like, how do you do that, you know? And when I sent these poems, after I came back from Iraq, I sent them to one of my teachers, T.R. Hummer, a poet, fine poet, and he said, he suggested I move one line. So, you know, in the original, I have seen him in the circle of light. Is this interesting to you? Is this too lecture-like? Yeah. Okay, all right. So I have seen him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song, wait a minute. I've seen him in the shadows. I've watched him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song hums in the wings of sandflies. And I just made that more confusing than I had to. Okay, let's make this clear. It started with, my mind has become very clear. I've watched him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song, and it says, all of that's very clear, right? But then it says his song. So it becomes like it's elevated and lifted with that word song. It's not narrative and detail oriented. And his song hums in the wings of sandflies. So we get this visual image of these sandflies hovering around this figure in the distance, right? So it feels like if you have the soldier looking at a vulnerable person with a weapon, sandflies feels like, for me, like there's a gesture there towards someone who's gonna die, and then the flies will come, you know, with dead bodies, right? And so it feels very sort of finished. And my teacher said, do it like this. And that's how it is in the book. I have seen him in the shadows. I've watched him in the circle of light my rifle brings to me. His song hums in the wings of sandflies. My mind has become very clear. And it's weird, right? Because it's an assertion. But I don't know about you, but I'm the writer of the poem. But I immediately, the little question comes. It's not a big question, but a little one, which is, well, what did you do? Did you pull the trigger, not pull the trigger? What happened, right? It brings me back into the poem. And the larger lesson I have there, and it's usually in art. I think this is I'm gonna throw a big one out there, not just poetry, but in art, at the end of a thing, the last note, that last ringing of the piano, is Omari's voice, and it faded and sank. There was a space there in the way that we all kept quiet as the last tones, remember? And then it just went. Right there is a space of potential such profound meaning, and it invites us as the audience to participate in the construction of the imagination of meaning, you know. And it's a place where we can linger. I think of it as like a well. You know, when you dig a well, you don't dig a well just to get one bucket of water. You dig it so you can keep getting more and more from that, right? And sustain yourself up. And when we create art, whether it's a poem or music or a film or an essay, the ending point is a very easy place for us to look for this process. How do we make the two happen? How do we make it end so it is complete, and yet open up in a way that invites us back in and pulls us literally back into the piece? Otherwise, you turn the page and there's nothing to make us read it again, right? And then as art, for those who are writers and artists, we can learn from the end because that's an obvious side of it, but look throughout the piece and see if there are other places where we can open up some air and leave space for the audience or the reader to participate in the construction of meaning, for all of us, the writer too, or the composer. Okay, enough lecture. Is that good for lecturing? Yeah. More, okay. Need a little water for a moment. I'll read the last poem that I wrote when I was in Iraq. We were on an air base, and we'd already turned in all our ammo and all that. Our vehicles had already been cleaned and put on and shipped off, going towards Kuwait to be put on boats and shipped home to America. And we were outside of the city of Mosul in the northern part of Iraq. And we had about 2 days. We were waiting for a plane that we would all get on that would fly us back home. And it was in a sort of a room that was maybe like from here to the exit sign, and about from the drapes to maybe the front row. It was very narrow and sort of long. And there were about 40 of us in there with all of our gear stacked in the center, so we're around the outside edges. People were playing cards, reading paperback books. I was writing this poem. A few others were doing push-ups so they could just get a little bit more ripped before they see their girlfriend back home, kind of thing. Very hopeful, you know. and I was writing this poem as if I was already on the plane. And what I didn't know is they call them chalks, each group. There were other groups waiting to go too. And when the plane would come, a chalk or a group of soldiers would get on and go. And they were worried about surface-to-air missiles being fired at them. And the Air Force pilots knew that, so they did countermeasures sometimes, and they did things to try to mitigate that. What we didn't know was the chalk before us took off, surface-to-air missile was fired, lodged in the fuselage, and then didn't explode. And they had to come back around land and do it again. And I was thinking, man, it's, you know, I was thinking about it, but that second flight for them must have been equally harrowing, I imagine. But I wrote this poem as if I'm on the plane looking back. It's called Night in Blue. At 7,000 feet and looking back, running lights blacked out under the wings, and America waiting. A year of my life disappears at midnight. The sky a deep viridian. The house lights below, small as match heads burned down to embers. Has this year made me a better lover? Will I understand something of hardship, of loss? Will a lover's sense this in my kiss or touch? What do I know of redemption or sacrifice? What will I have to say of the dead? That it was worth it? That any of it made sense? I have no words to speak of war. I never dug the graves in Tulifar. I never held the mother crying in Ramadi. I never lifted my friend's body when they carried him home. I have only the shadows under the leaves to take with me, the quiet of the desert, the low fog of Balad, orange groves with ice forming on the rinds of fruit. I have a woman crying in my ear late at night when the stars go dim. Moonlight and sand is a resonance of the dust of bones and nothing more. Thank you. I wonder sometimes, do you wonder this too? Like when these soldiers come home from whatever they've been a part of, what was their experience, and like what are they bringing home with them? You know, what do they hope when they come home? I probably don't have time today to talk about like the suicide rate among veterans, but it's like estimated around 22 a day or something like that. And but you know, it's interesting to me because, I mean, that's so important and so necessary to do. And at the same time, and I've seen those reports and different variations of them in major newspapers over the last 20 years now, right? But I've yet to see an American newspaper or news outlet ask a version of this question. What's the suicide rate like for the Iraqis and the Afghan people? Like, how are they doing? And if we don't ask the question, does that tell us something about how much we care? Or how open we are to a larger kind of empathy? Or are we just so, my little life is just crushed. I'm like, where is there time to, like, I'd like to do more things with my dog. I have a golden retriever. I just like to make her happy. And like making her happy is a lot, you know? How do I empathetically connect or be useful in some way to the Iraqi people? But if we're gonna go to war with a people, what does it mean after? Like, what's the intention for after? Is it to never be friends again? Or is there a way where, do you know what I mean? Like, because I'm talking about Iran right now, right? You know, I mean, I'm talking about Iraq, but it's just, and when I was reading these poems when they came out in 2005, this first book, I was looking at some of my heroes, like these writers from the Vietnam War, like Bruce Weigel, and I remember reading with him, and Yusef Komunyakaa, and I can name more names, but I knew when I was asking questions like this, I was looking at them because you could see in their eyes, they were like, they'd been asking those questions for 20 years too. Doesn't that seem like a kind of pathology for a people to keep asking questions and not figuring out a way to work their way through it and to repeat a similar process? Deal here. So what I'd like to ask of you is if you would help me with this next poem. And it really needs a group poem, but it's very simple. And you'll have plenty of time to breathe in between. There's so much mystery the way I'm couching this. But all I'm going to ask you to do is hum, right? Because I'd like to, this is a poem that I wrote while I was in Iraq, but I would like to read this and share together for all who are involved in the war in Iran and Israel and all that whole area where there's so much pain and fright and loss. And it's a kind of prayer. It's called Jamil, which, if I understand right, means like beautiful or beauty. So what I'd ask you to do is just to, and this is a thing called sympathetic vibrations. Might be a little woo-woo, but we're on the left coast, right? We're here, baby, you know? All I ask you to do is hum, and I'm not in pitch or in key or anything like that. I should have asked ahead of time, but just, can you help me? And I'm going to read this poem while you're humming, and come on, let's keep practicing so we can get good at this. And this is going to be on live on YouTube. This will be like recorded later. It'll be an audio thing. We're going to take this to Spotify or not Spotify. We're going to go somewhere that we, you know. It's called Jamil. And cowbirds rest on the groves of date palms, whole flocks of them, white as flowers blossoming into wings when the wind rises up. Thistleweed bursts open in purple, while honeybees drone and hover over the yellowing early summer field. They say to produce 1 pound of honey, bees must travel from flower to hive at least 12,000 times. Such patience, waiting for the storm to be carried over the far mountains when the earth darkens and the sky lowers and cowbirds shield themselves under a wing, the nectar swaying heavy within the closed flower, the hive humming its prayer under the rain's falling hush. Thank you for having me. All right, we're going platinum with that stuff. Lovers. They kiss the bruised flowers in each other's skin. They moan in a sweet friction of muscle and bone. They flare in blue sparks from the tips of their hair. They transform the grief and pain stored deep in the body. They transpose sheets of cotton and silk into a tablature of music. They drink from the loneliness and solitude, the quiet of a lifetime. They taste the bright days of summer, the dying leaves of autumn. They write with their tongues over the curving sweep of history. They write with cubes of ice melting in their mouths, cursive by cursive. They astonish themselves with what they discover in one another. They spiral one soul into another, the world vanishing around them. They blur their bodies in a tangle of limbs and hair and fingers and tongues. They ride the animal of pleasure until it shudders through the body in waves. They ride the twin signatures of the Valkyries in their light-encrusted saddles, and they cry out to the gods in the heavens and to the gods within themselves, and they cry out at midnight in an appealing thunder of an afternoon, and they come with mouths bitten into flesh, a flood of endorphins released. And they come exhausted into the sweat-soaked moonlight, the sun-drenched day, and the lovers come until they are made radiant, breathless, wordless, vulnerable, because they are lovers transforming the pain and grief stored deep in the body, because they are lovers moaning in a sweet friction of muscle and bone, because they are lovers flaring blue sparks from the tips of their hair, because they are lovers kissing the bruised flowers in each other's skin. Someone was calling me during that. 10:52, I hear you. Only 10:52 is going to know what that's about. You all doing all right? Okay. Let me make sure. This preacher mode just gets me going, so I don't want to. I'm going to read a very short essay. It's a kind of a lyric essay. I reached out to a scientist. This is back when Twitter was, kind of a thing, and I was on there tweeting until it just became like a cesspool hell pit, I mean, it was, but got more so, But one of the cool things about it back then is that I could reach out to a scientist in a whole other field and say, hey, I'm a poet, and I hope you don't mind, but can you help me with this thing I'm writing, this essay about these amazing animals that you study and research? And Dr. Michelle Troutwine is written actually in one of her pieces. She says, it's sort of a meditative process of looking through this microforest of follicles and hairs and looking for just the right potential movement or shape. And I'm going to read a thing now that might be a little uncomfortable, just so you know. Don't go home and get some exfoliant and over-scrub your face tonight because of this. This is just a natural process we've done for millennia with the human body, and it's called the Lovers. It's near midnight on a Friday, and in the periphery of my vision, a mosquito banks in a wide orbit around me. Such quiet determination it has, such patience. It's not unlike the patience exhibited by the microscopic world as it waits each day for us to sink into the pillows and wander into the hours of dream. If we could look closely enough at our own skin, and if we magnified that landscape so that the fine downy hairs of the body, known as vellus hair, might rise into view like the trunks of saplings, and if we were to walk in that strange grove of leafless trees and then peer down into the pores which hold each knotted root as it forms below, where the well of the follicle is coated in oil secreted by a sebaceous gland, we discover the home of Demodex follicularum and Demodex brevis, mites. These are microscopic animals, whole communities of them, and they have dwelled in human skin likely since our earliest ancestors looked up in wonder at the stars. With claw-tipped legs and fusiform bodies, they are arachnids, cousin to the spider, and their lives span the duration of about 2 weeks. Some estimates, and this is true, some estimates suggest we harbor hundreds of thousands of these animals within the largest organ of our bodies, our skin. Think eyelashes, tiny follicles and pores of the forehead, nose, cheeks. By day, they clamp onto the hair follicle itself, and it's thought that they feed from the oils there. It's possible they might also feed from the ragged waste of dead skin cells. Some suggest they insert a retractable needle from their mouth organ. Why do they have to call it a mouth organ? They can't just call it a mouth, But this retractable needle from their mouth organ, and they nourish themselves by draining the fluids from within the cell. They face downward as they do so, as if staring into the burrow they live in, while others work their way into the deepest structures of the pore, except while laying eggs outside of the burrow. And it's crazy to think of our faces as this landscape of burrows for mites, As we speak, our diaphragms compress to funnel air out of the lungs and through the tracheal tube so that it might be modulated within the larynx. The things we say to one another and to ourselves resonate through the bones of our skulls. Sound waves travel throughout our bodies, and that language also travels through the fluid cellular structures of our skin in a muted version of the original, where the mites live. There in the crosshatched shadows where strands of hair curl over in a gentle matting of keratin and oil. By night, Demodex mites living in our faces emerge from their dens in search of a lover to mate with. They travel at about 16 millimeters per hour, or a little over half an inch. And I wonder if they recognize in the rise and fall of their terrain as we whisper to one another in the dark, or when we make love in the hours before dawn. I imagine them pausing in their own lovemaking then, or as they travel from one burrow to another. Under a canopy of fine, tangling hair, they tilt their heads back to take in the darkness, which is sweet and washed in pheromones, to consider how strange the world is, how mysterious, how fortunate they are to live in this forest of lovers, where the voices of the gods sometimes call out across the sky, and the thunder of it rolls through the living flesh of the world they know as their one and only home. So try not to keep, thank you. I hope time makes sense to me. Maybe a couple more, and then we'll start a conversation. Does that seem about right? You all good with that? Before I do, I would like to thank Kurt Erickson and Omari, and thank you both, for your artistry, for making this happen. David and all of you for coming. I appreciate you allowing me to be up here. I look forward to what you will do, and one day when I can cheer the good work you're doing as well. That's partly why I gave you the cell phone number, because I assume you'll lose it and forget about it over time. But at some point, I'm getting a little long in the tooth and all that. Who knows if I'm around? You get hit by a bread truck, you're gone. It happens, So, but if I'm around, and if you have some project where you think I could be of use to that project, I can always be reached through my publishers, and they'll forward the email on, and I'll do my best to roll up my sleeves and help you with your good project. So for now, I'll finish with a poem, and then maybe we'll have a conversation over here. But this poem, do you ever hear of Lawn Chair Larry? Does anybody know that name? If you look it up, you'll find that there's a guy down in LA or San Diego or something, and you'll see him in this poem doing some pretty crazy stuff. And I mean, you don't get a name like Lawn Chair Larry without doing some stuff that's a little crazy. And but he's not the only one. I was surprised to find this out because there have been a few around the world, and you'll see another one of those in this poem. It's called Paper Lanterns. We lift our hands into the banded light at dusk and let go, as each lantern wobbles on the air before the invisible carries it into the heliotrope of twilight. It is something to see this quiet fleet of prayer rising into darkness. And it's not unlike the weather balloons a man once filled with helium tethered to a lawn chair, a fragile airship he built to enter the sublime, ascending into the atmosphere before floating over the Pacific at 15,000 feet. In Japan, Yoshikazu Suzuki followed his lead, departing from Lake Biwa, where I once stood before the gravestone of Matsuo Basho, hoping it might help me in the creation of my own haibun. I have no way of knowing what Suzuki may have been thinking. He was last spotted 500 miles out over the ocean, never to be seen again. Though I imagine him still up there, coasting on the trade winds, witness to the sun and moon, clouds pluming into great anvil heads of rain, nights stunned by tree-shaped voltages of lightning. And just as Suzuki begins to despair of his solitude, these slow-moving flocks of light rise up to greet him. All our earthly prayers sent from the midnight shores of our lives, and Suzuki, an old man now, drifting over the curving sphere he knows by heart, cries into his weathered hands, cries at the sweetness of it all. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll grab a chair and I'll grab the mic real quick. Maybe we can bring up the house lights, if that's possible. I don't know, but it's okay if we don't. But oh, it's good. I can see you. We should have done this before. Hello, everybody. Some of you are like, "Oh man, I was zonked. I was out." That was because I do have that like 3 a.m. radio voice. It's just like, yeah. Now time, we're going to play a song. I don't know. Why don't you just go to sleep now? I used to be a DJ at Fresno State. After I was at Fresno City for 2 years, and then I went over to Fresno State, and I was the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. DJ. And I think I had like 2 or 3 listeners. One of them was the custodial guy outside. He was super cool. And I always knew if I was doing okay with the show, because when I took a break and walked out, if he was playing my show, then I knew I was doing a good job. But more often than not, Saturday, I would come out and he would have another channel, and I'm like, oh man, I got to bump up my game here and get better at this stuff. Yeah. I'll try to give you a little bit of time, but if you have, are there questions or insults or anything? Probably the insults are on the text messages, I imagine. But I'm happy to think through some stuff with you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is such an
it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to be able to, you'll find very quickly, like, he didn't answer the questions at all. He just went off-roading. It was like, but hopefully it resonates in some ways. The first one, I was thinking, I went back after I was in Iraq from 2003 to 2004. And in 2011, I did a story for National Geographic, and I went back for a bit, and I was in Baghdad. And I took that assignment because it wasn't to talk to the power players. Oftentimes those stories, they'll meet with the mayor and different people who can see the bird's eye view. But the story really intrigued me because the National Geographic said, no, we want you to go in and meet people that are everyday people living in Baghdad, So I wrote a list of people my family did, like my uncle used to work on cars and stuff, and another person in my family had pigeons, and I remember pigeons were like a thing. You'd see them. Sometimes we were told that some small communities would put the pigeons up in flight as a signal that troops were in the area, And I remember my dad was a welder, so I tried to find a fortune teller, and I was able to meet with a fortune teller. She was amazing. But I went out north of Baghdad. I remember when I was in uniform, we were driving just north of the city, and there's this massive trash area for the city's trash, and it's like these hills, and there were cows out there. I gestured to it in a poem earlier, actually. Milk cows bellow in a field of trash. That's kind of like a gesture to that. But I remember walking, because there was a traffic jam, so we had to get out of the vehicle. I remember walking, and I could smell and see the place, and it really fascinated me, but we couldn't go in there and see because we had to keep moving. But when I came back, I made a mission to go out because I'd seen people out there picking through the trash off in the distance. So I wanted to go talk to them, and I went out there, and there was a small mosque in the center, and they had rigged lines to a local neighborhood to bring some power out to these sort of ramshackle houses there. And there were kids there who were kind of stateless, from my understanding. What I was told through an interpreter is that there were sons of Al-Qaeda, it was told. So there were foreign fighters, but they had like a nickname. Whether it was true or not, I don't know, because I wasn't able to. I'm not a journalist by trade, I'm just trying to listen and pay attention. But what I'm looking at are these children who they were their own family together, because they were disconnected from families and houseless, living out in the middle of this, and I thought this beyond them, not just them, but all the children in Iraq when we were there, and then afterwards. I hope this isn't too long of a story. We went over to Baghdad University. I remember talking to university students there at this stone table outside of the classes, and one of them, they were talking not just about not just coalition forces, but like all the adults, Iraqi and American, whatever, all the adults older, right? They were gesturing them, and they were saying, they got a childhood. I never got a childhood because they were raised in a time of war, And that line really sticks with me, and it makes me, something I can learn from that. And I've said for years that I think like my poems are kind of a placeholder, one of many placeholders for the conversation until, if they survive and they grow to be able to write their story down. Because I think children in a combat zone can tell us much more about war and violence and pain and suffering and loss than what I understand of it, if that makes sense. I certainly could from those students at Baghdad University. That's a weird way to get your question, but the second part of the question, I think on a very, very practical level, I've been asked by different political parties here in the States over the last 20 years to come to their different events and stuff, and I do have a general political leaning towards a party, but I really hesitate to talk about that here because I want the art to do work that's outside of that and in critique and conversation with it. I never say yes to any of those events, regardless of where it comes on the spectrum, because I don't want the art to be co-opted for an event kind of thing. And I want to try to find a way to speak to a deeper rooted human thing. And in fact, I remember after 2000, when I came back in 2005, the war in Iraq especially, Afghanistan started picking up and getting more news coverage a little bit later, but 2005 to about 2009 or so, the Iraq war was very much in the news here, right? And you would see body counts talked about, how many dead Americans, usually dead soldiers. Sometimes Ted Koppel listed off some of the names on a newscast at one point, and then it just started getting quieter and quieter, that conversation, because the war just kept going and the narrative didn't change. So it wasn't news anymore. It just became autonomic sort of process culturally. We would hear about a bombing in a city we'd never heard of, some name that was difficult to maybe pronounce, for me at least. We hear about 5 people killed and 11 wounded, right? And if it was in a print journal, it would just be the number 5 sometimes, not even F-I-V-E for space, you know? But how do you take 5 lives and then take, like, say, the 5 of you, right? And me too, I'll be part of the 5, you know what I mean? And take our lives and crunch us down into this number 5. 5 died, and then 11 were wounded. But like, to some of you, do you have any brothers or sisters, right? Do you have like a favorite hobby? Do you have food that you just can't stand, you know? Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like, you just keep going, really get to know each other and start to, there's a place in the library called the Dream, what was that called, the Dream? Yeah, the Dream Center. You have a thing here called the Dream Center. I gotta go to this thing. You know what I mean? But each of us are dream centers. You know, there are dreams and hovering, you carry the whole world. They call it sonder, right? Do you know that word sonder? You do? Oh, awesome, right? So the word sonder, if I'm describing it right, is the idea when you're walking through a crowd or you're drinking a latte or something at a coffee shop and you look over and you see someone just sort of scanning and taking in the environment, looking, like we are the extras in their world, right? We are all the extras in each other's worlds. And then sometimes we get to know each other a little bit more. We get more of a character in the, you know what I mean? Part of a tribe, maybe. See how I drifted from the question? But how can we break down this so it's not just you know, because like I live in Florida now, and if I drive up to Georgia, when I'm driving, there's a billboard when it says "Welcome to Georgia," you know. If you go the other way, it says "Welcome to Florida." And then if I stopped right there, I did this in Uganda once. They have the road painted right where the hemisphere is supposed to be, so I could stand with one foot in one hemisphere of the world and one in the other part of the planet, right? But when you go from Florida to there, it isn't painted on the road like a line. But if I got out with my phone, I could zoom in, and maybe it would be somewhere I was at. I have a friend, Kim, and she's a land surveyor. I could get her out there and she'd be like, it's right there, you know? And I asked her one time, because I was thinking about the border with Mexico and America, and I asked her, I said, how legally, how wide is the border? And she said, well, it's a line, and a line has no width. Yeah. I know, it blows your brain, right? Mine, yeah. And it's really interesting. And when I go from Florida to Georgia, nobody stops me, at least yet. Right? Nobody stops me going the other way. These 2 tribes, the Floridians, it's an interesting bunch. And then Georgia, also an interesting bunch, you know? And those 2, but there's nobody there to be like, nah, yeah, come on, you just go in between, you know? But how can we extend that sort of thinking across the curvature of the globe to recognize that we all share in the oxygen of our time? It's an easy thing to say. It's so hard to put that in practice, you know? I think there was one historian that, I wish I could remember the facts on this, but I remember this historian say something like in recorded history, they think there are about 29 years of actual peace. And I actually think that's probably not true, because there's probably some farmer had a vendetta and like whacked another farmer on the head, you know what I mean? But it's so hard to like quell the human heart and be, you know, to look towards wonder. Remember early on I said towards wonder and curiosity, and then I said towards difficult things. How can we make a place for all of us to have a dream center? I forgot the dream. How can we have dream centers and help with that with each other? It feels lofty, but like, right, we're here, like, how do atoms even hold my body together right now? Like, it's each of us, like, it's, right? I know you've thought through all that, you know? Like, and it's worked, the universe has worked so hard to make each of us. And how can we honor that in each other? That the universe has put that much work into creating this human, you know? So I hope, I feel like it's very unsatisfying, but I hope that might have got to some of the stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, my fellow student, Stacy Brown,
Stacy.
when she did the V thing?
With the V, I
Yeah.
love that analogy with the V because when you were speaking, I kind of felt like, I'm the V in my own life sometimes,
Yeah.
where I feel like it's an end, like it's just an end. But when you said she told you to start opening up that end at the end and started opening, I started thinking to myself like maybe I should do that in my own life and start looking at my experiences and know that it's never just the end. It's more to the story than me just being that V. Like I'm more than that V, and I can open up my experience and look at life in a different perspective.
What's your name?
Open that. Tamani.
Nice to meet you, Smani. I apologize, I didn't ask your name, sir. What was it?
Max.
Max, nice to meet you, Max. Yeah, I think of it. I think there's different ways to think of that too. And maybe it's connected, and maybe helpful. I sort of think of that as a space to linger, and how can we linger in a site of meaning? And if we feel like our life has come to a point, kind of thing, then that's an interesting space to linger and think, what does that mean, and what is that point? And then, have you seen those decision trees? I think I mentioned in one poem, the decision tree, where you see all these branches leading. It's like a tree going one, and then, but at that point, as long as we keep going, if we don't get hit by the bread truck that I talked about earlier, right? Then from that point that feels finished, there's this whole other crazy decision tree possible of the next moment. But we're in the in-between right there where you can linger and think about where are we and where does this go at this point, I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, no, it's an interesting thing to think about, ponder. Yeah, uh-oh, now I'm in trouble. The whole gang here, except you, it's interesting. You're like, no, I'm not playing this one.
The way we write is the way we live our life. Is there something?
Yeah.
You
Uh-oh, Rachel, I knew you were coming, but I didn't see you there. So,
what you
yeah.
said just reminded me of that.
The way we write is the way we live. Is that right?
Something like that. I don't know. I thought maybe somebody else.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah. We're many years we've been friends, so it's so good to see you, Rachel. Thanks for making it over here. Hopefully we can talk after too. Yeah.
Are you a believer?
I am, but I have. When I was a kid, my mom was a single parent for a bit of that, and so I was about 7 or 8. And there was one point when I was in first grade where 3 of my friends invited me to different religious services, and so I went with them. And each one was like all in, you know what I mean? And there was one, I think I went to a synagogue, and I went to a Baptist thing, and I went to a Catholic thing. But it could have been others too, but I just happened to go to those 3. And at 6 or 7, I went in, and there was so much sort of ritual and things happening, and I could just see this fervent belief in this way. No, this way. Oh, this way. And I have not been able to shake this, I apologize, but I just thought in my mind, all of them know, but none of them know.
Right.
And so I'm going to have to figure out my own way. And I have not been able to shake that sense. So I don't know what all I believe in, but I'm interested in the idea of a unified field where meaning comes up. A little bit like, from my understanding of Hinduism, and this idea of a drop of water, like, oh, I'm a drop of water. I'm a lifetime. I'm Brian. And then when it falls at the end of the bread truck, bam, hits him, falls into the water, and part of this universal field, or this consciousness of a Godhead, we might call it, So I'm leaning towards that, but I don't know. It's a mystery that fascinates me, and I find it very beautiful, the movement of it. I feel like I should get over here because it was like a whole raft of questions coming from over here. Yeah.
I had a question about artists and our responsibility, I guess, as artists, to maybe, or I guess my question is, what might an artist's responsibility be in a moment, or I guess a period of political unrest, civil unrest?
Right. So thank you. Your name?
Dom.
Thanks. So for those on live stream, that's what might an artist's responsibility be in a time of civil unrest and great difficulty or trouble in the world? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Something like that. I think it's for me, I feel like it's the whole wide spectrum of possibility. We need people who are, there need to be voices that push up against power that's being used in ways that are not good for the people. You know, that's just big general blanket thing, right? So people out in this, using art in ways, I'm just talking about artists, right? Using art in ways that, and then we need artists who can ask the questions more clearly. I think I try to fall into that camp a little bit. That's where I feel a natural home, usually. But we also need, and if you find yourself as this kind of writer, I think this is equally valuable with the others. We need a writer like an Emily Dickinson kind of writer whose poems aren't really widely known in her lifetime, and she's writing them and putting them in a desk drawer. And she's an interior poet. Because we need art that can be engaged with the whole spectrum of human experience, if that makes sense. That's what I think. Sometimes I remember I was in LA at a college and I read, and there were all these groups there, but there were a lot of veterans. I was just part of a conference, so there were many presentations happening that day, and there were like 30 or 60 veterans. They all had these veteran shirts, and I had seen their thing that they were doing earlier, and they were right in front of me, and there was like about 600 people in this audience, right? And so, because I could see the shirts on his block, I never know fully where the poems are going to lead me. You know, I don't have, I'm going to make sure I talk about, I have some ideas, but who knows, the bread truck shows up. I don't know that was going to happen today. You know what I mean? So I was really focused on them. 60% of the time there were things that were kind of catered to questions might go to them. The way I did a little bit with the English department today, and I had some that I gave my phone out like I did. I remember there's a moratorium until midnight. Like 2 weeks later, something like that, I was walking to Washington Square Park in New York City. This guy was playing saxophone. It was really nice, I was really enjoying the day. And my phone goes off, and it's a text. And this person had this long thing saying, you had the microphone. You were there in front of people with your art. And you didn't call out truth to power. You just were like talking to the veterans all the time. And then it said, "What's your truth, Turner?" That was the last line. And I almost said fuck you. And I stopped and I was like, no, because I know I agree with the person that texted me this. Our Venn diagram is really well suited for one another. So I sent back a more thoughtful response, and then the thoughtful response came back, and then we did. The weird part of this story is that 2 days later I got a ping on Google Alerts from my name. And there was a story, and it was a journalist who had taken my number. Didn't tell me they were journalists. They quoted me from so they could have had that "F you" as my response. I didn't quick with that. So, the lesson learned is pause before you respond with people. But I hope that's helpful. I think the wide range is necessary. It's difficult. The ones who are being seemingly quiet, they can feel like they're not doing enough. And they can also be looked at like they're not doing enough by other artists and just people in general. But I think it's important for artists to look to the left and right and see people who may be doing different work and recognize that work is valuable too, even if it isn't necessarily, you know what I mean? And it's hard to do that though, because no, real lives are on the line, what are you doing? But that other work is important, So, yeah. If you don't mind, I'll do a poor job of this, but I'll try to just very briefly paraphrase for the live stream because they can't hear you necessarily. But I'll just say that there's an artist here who also says just be you as an artist, and that's how you can be valuable to the community and to the art form. I hope that's okay. And I know some of you have to leave. You have to do push-ups if you leave, just so you know. Run around the building, you know. But thank you all for those who could. I'm going to go in the back here.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a quick question. Being a poet and writer for so many years, do you have any specific emotion or feeling which is the hardest to explain, to describe?
Yeah, in the art itself, the hardest sort of emotion or thing for me to get into the artwork, and I think this is true, speaking of poetry and contemporary work, it's true across the board from my experience, because is humor. And I think it's really hard for American poetry to be humorous, and I think it's, or I should say it's an underdeveloped muscle that we could use in our work more as a whole. And definitely in my work, there were things like even in uniform, as I was going to write about this experience of being in the military, it seems hard to, but there's really funny things that happen that are difficult whenever it's told outside of that community, you know. So I'd recommend, and it's a very cathartic medicine, humor, because usually humor is usually connected to pain of some sort. And find a way to laugh is a way the body releases. So the way when we have tears, we release toxins from our body, right? And laughing does a similar kind of thing, I think. And I like to laugh at myself, which is easy because there's daily reasons for me to laugh, you know? But it often doesn't show up in my work. My work is often so serious and takes itself a little seriously. And I think that's where I could grow, at least personally. So thank you for the question. I think there's one of you, and I'll come back. And yes, sir. When I talked about bruised flowers, what was I trying to encapsulate with that phrase? Well, I'm a writer that doesn't like to do the reader's work or the audience's work. This isn't a cop-out. I mean, I've intentionally done this for my whole life as an artist, trying not to get it, because I think the pleasure of being a reader myself and being an audience member is to think like how, because we participate in the construction of meaning. So like, you know, the poem, I'm using language on the page, there's stanzas, and the word stanza, do you know the root in Italian, what stanza means? English majors? Okay, a couple of them had to duck out for the class. Okay, sorry to put you on the spot. It's the Italian, if I understand right, it means like a stance as part of the derivation, but it's also like a room. And a stanza, and we could extend this to like a paragraph, but they're rooms or architectures or like building, you know, it's kind of architecture. And room by room, stanza by stanza, we create this architecture to house the imagination. But when I give you what is this thing called? Not a trick question.
A stand or?
A stand. We'll get fancy, call it a lectern maybe? Okay, we'll call it a lectern. I'm looking at it from here, you're looking from there. This little, there's I don't know if there are philosophy majors in the house, but it gets to Descartes a little bit, the discourse on method. That's a heavy read, like 60 pages, and I read Brian boiling it down, looking at this. I'd say, you know, you're looking at it from there. We're looking at the same thing. We're agreeing to use a word stand. Let's use the word stand, S-T-A-N-D. And, but the angle you're looking at, you see a different version of it than I do. So even though we're talking about the same thing, we're seeing a different version. So when I put the word stand in a poem in a line, and you're just reading through, because there's bigger things happening, because behind the stand, this person said this thing about love that is going to change your life, right? But the word stand helps us get there in the line. So in the mind, when we read or we hear it, we do it so fast. You have to go into the warehouse in your brain and go to like the furniture department and find these massive warehouses of stands. Be like, oh yeah, I need a wood one, no, blocky one, and it's, you know, grab a stand, put it in the sentence. So we're creating imagination, you know, and I don't want to get in the way of that. So the bruised flowers that you imagine, as long as you can look to the text and the moment and have reasons to say this is why I think it is, then you may discover something about the poem that I, even as the author, so I'm not right, is the way I try to approach art.
Okay.
But it's not fuzzy like, well, this is what I feel. I still think we owe it to the art form to have reasons to be able to say this is why it's so, and I think it's working in such and such way. So thank you all.